Hello, and a warm welcome to the 13th speaker series, A Sense of Place, Indigenous Perspectives of Land, Water, and Sky. This series is hosted by the Indigenous Education Institute. Today's session is supported by NASA HEAT, the NASA Heliophysics Education Activation Team, led by Michael Kirk. It is also supported by the San Juan Island National Historical Park, led by Superintendent Alexis Freedy. My name is Dr. Nancy Mary Boy. I am Diné and Tsalagi, which means Navajo and Cherokee. My Cherokee name is Tsawayuga, and I am from the Cherokee Bird Clan. I'm also of the Deer Springs Clan and the Honeycomb Rock Cliff Dweller Clan, Tsenjakine, of the Diné. I'm the founding president and executive director of the Indigenous Education Institute, which has been in existence for more than 25 years. We are located in the San Juan Islands of Washington State and in the Navajo Nation. Over the past 4 years, we have presented 12 sessions of our original speaker series. We've been featuring renowned Indigenous speakers from around the United States and Canada. I would like to begin today with a heartfelt acknowledgement of the Indigenous peoples of our Mother Earth, to honor our many participants from around the world. Usually, we acknowledge the land on which we are living or presenting. But in this day and age of virtual online realities and the pandemic of COVID-19, we wish to honor all Indigenous people around the world. I also want to acknowledge that I currently reside on the ancestral lands of the saltwater salmon people of the Salish Sea, who have called this place home since time immemorial. I honor the inherent and acquired treaty rights of these Indigenous peoples. The presentations in this series have been chosen to reflect an awareness of the foundations of traditional Indigenous thinking and living. In our native ways, everything is interconnected. So, rather than a specific focus on biology, astronomy, or other separate disciplines, we will be presenting dynamic worlds of interrelationships and processes of reciprocity. An additional focus for this speaker series is expanding awareness and understanding of cultural differences, and to support successful and diverse working relationships, whether it be in education, national resource management, astronomy, NASA, museums, and science centers, and most importantly, tribal communities. Today, we are honored to bring you Dr. Polly O. Walker, the chairperson of our board of the Indigenous Education Institute. I want to personally thank you for attending this webinar. The interest you have shown is heartwarming to us. We now have over 530 people registered from all across the United States, and we have participants all around the world, including Canada, Norway, and Germany. It is also interesting and heartwarming for me that we have more than 30 different tribes represented in our registrations for this presentation. Almost all our presentations for the sense of place, Indigenous perspectives on land, water, and sky, have been recorded and can be downloaded at the Indigenous Education Institute website shortly following the events. Since you have all registered by email, we will also share notices to you for our upcoming presentations. Dr. Walker is of Cherokee ancestry and a member of the Cherokee Southwest Township. an associate professor emeritus of peace and conflict studies at Juniata College. Her research and practice focus on Indigenous / non-Indigenous conflict transformation, as well as Indigenous approaches to peace and the role of arts and cultural work in transforming conflict. Polly's doctoral degree in conflict transformation from the University of Queensland in Australia, and she has worked in collaborative peace-building endeavors in Vanuatu. She is a director of the Peace and Conflict Studies Institute of Australia, and she has held leadership positions in the Peace and Justice Studies of the United States and Canada, as well as in the International Peace Research Association. So with all of these multiple experiences and educational backgrounds and on-site backgrounds, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Polly O. Walker. Polly, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Nancy. Osio, Chichalagi, Gela, Cherokee, Southwest Township, Homelands of Pueblo, Sandia Chinela, Nato Hirai de Hesti. Greetings, I am of Cherokee ancestry and a member of the Cherokee Southwest Township. I'm currently living on the homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The Cherokee phrase, "May we live together in peace," is the foundation of my collaboration in transforming conflict. And now I'd like to ask Chris if he could start the PowerPoints. Thank you. You will see here in the title of my talk, Moving Toward Balance and Harmony. This concept is a part of many Indigenous approaches to transforming conflict. Concepts of peace in Indigenous worlds often incorporate this concept of a dynamic balance. Tom Bell, a Cherokee knowledge holder and language speaker, explains that in the Cherokee language, the word for peace is based on the root word tohi, which means the proper or normal state of the world. Cherokee conceptualizations of peace are based on balance in relationships, moving in a fluid way with the harmony of the cosmos within an eco-relational paradigm. Tom Belt also shares the meaning of the Cherokee word for peace, which is naktohiada, one of the words that I used in my grieving. It means that one is in harmony and balance within oneself and with all of one's relations in the natural and spirit worlds. When I use the Western term conflict transformation, I'm referring to the processes and relationships that address intractable conflict. Conflict that has continued for an extended period of time, causes great harm and pain, and has not been resolved through diplomacy, mediation, negotiation, or problem solving. Today, I'll focus on some of the central characteristics of conflict transformation, and I'll share with you some of my experiences of learning from Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who are collaborating with integrity to transform conflict in the direction of balance and harmony. Next slide. The characteristics of conflict transformation that I will address today are, number one, a focus on process. So not a strong focus on the outcome, you get to the outcome that's peaceful and that's just by focusing on the process. And this process includes honoring and ethically engaging across different worldviews. Number two, an emphasis on relationships. Yes, with other humans, with five-fingered ones, but also with the natural world, with the spirit world, ancestors, and with place. And I'll talk more about place, the concept of place later on. And the third point is addressing the underlying issues, which may be hundreds of years old, that are exacerbating the conflict, that are keeping the conflict stuck in place, and also envisioning and supporting a future that's moving towards balance and harmony. Next slide. I'd like now to share an example. I had the honor of working in Vanuatu with the Mavatamari Council of Chiefs, and I think this collaboration, although certainly not perfect, and I will share some of our mistakes, was a collaboration with integrity. in enhancing Indigenous conflict transformation through a custom governance project. Next slide. In case you're not familiar with Vanuatu, it's an island archipelago nation off of the northeast coast of Australia. And our collaboration there honored Indigenous worldviews, and it also addressed differences in worldviews and came face to face with worldview power imbalances. In part, this honoring of Indigenous worldviews took place through elicitive processes, which means we didn't come in with something from the outside, from Australia. We worked with the knowledge about conflict from within each of the different provinces of Vanuatu. It also focused on awareness of and response to historical injustices. So just because we had PhDs doesn't mean we can ignore everything that's happened in the past and how that's affecting people in the present. And also a major part of our collaboration was honoring the role of ceremony as an integral part of conflict transformation. I've been in many situations where non-Indigenous people think that the ceremonies were for entertainment, or they were something to be gotten out of the way to get to the serious work. But as you will see in the practice stories that I share, ceremony is an integral part of the serious work of conflict transformation. So in the first decade of this century, I was part of a 6-year collaboration here, and it was designed to enhance, not to transplant or change, but to enhance Indigenous conflict transformation. They had all kinds of new conflicts that weren't set up in custom law, and the chiefs wanted to address them in effective ways. So the project partners were the Malwa-Tamari National Council of Chiefs, all Ni Vanuatu, which means all Vanuatu citizens of Melanesian descent. Another partner was the University of Queensland, UQ, and another one was the Australian Government Overseas Aid Program, AusAid. So the partnership began in 2005, and we were actually invited by the Malwa-Tamari Council of Chiefs. They heard one of our senior scholars speak at a conference, and they said, "We really like your approach and your ideas, and we don't feel like you'll come in with a colonial approach. Would you work with us?" So for about a year and a half, we had a team working together, both of Ni Vanuatu and people from Australia, myself of Cherokee descent and others, white Australians, working to think, how can we enhance Indigenous conflict resolution, conflict transformation, but not in a way that supplants it in any way, because we knew the history of it. Of Vanuatu, it's a post-colonial state, and it continues to deal with the complex pressures of colonialism, westernization, globalization, and social change. Ni Vanuatu have a history of dealing creatively to accommodate these changes. However, they did request more support in making their processes more effective. The customary chiefs in Vanuatu have been credited for as much as 85% of security and the governance in Vanuatu's provinces. In fact, they're written into the Constitution of Vanuatu. However, they're facing many new challenges that custom law was not designed to address. So when we collaboratively developed these sharing sessions, those of us at the University of Queensland were aware of how Western models too often have either appropriated Indigenous knowledge or they have disregarded Indigenous knowledge and assumed that Western knowledge was the professional way to approach. We knew we did not want to do that. We did not want to take another neo-colonial approach. So we worked with the Malwa-Tamari, and we decided we would do what's called elicitive sharing. And that means recentering, that all of the Indigenous Ni Vanuatu approaches were centered, that we drew first on their knowledge and their experience and shared it. And only then did we introduce Western skills in conflict transformation, which could then be compared and contrasted for how appropriate or effective they might be. So elicitive means starting, it means honoring the Indigenous people and honoring their ways of knowing and being. So this supports both the participants' articulation of this, which may just seem normal to them. They may not ever have clearly set that out in a framework, particularly from people from other provinces who may have a very different approach to transforming conflict. And it's an articulation of their own ethno-conflict theory and practice. So for that first year, we built relationships and we created a shared process that recentered Indigenous peoples and their ways of knowing and being. Next slide. Each of our gatherings of coming together started with ceremony. We avoided, as I said, that as an integral part of the transformation. And we then moved into the Nakamal, which is the formal chief's meeting house, but we didn't say we're there for training. Training indicates that we have some kind of outsider expertise and are coming in to share it. When we were working with the Malvatamari, they said, we have a word for this. It's called a storion. An historion is when we all get together and we share our stories and we share our knowledge. So we called our sessions their storions. And they began with the formal custom ceremony, honoring the ancestors and honoring those now living who are bearing the Nivanawatu ways of knowing and being. Then we introduced all of the chiefs and the women participants. What did elicitive mean? Because they were so used to people coming in from the outside with the professional package. We do this, we do this. And we're going to start on drawing on your own knowledge. This also comes with some pitfalls, as I will shortly explain. We formed groups within the Nakamal because, as I said, people from different provinces, different islands who didn't have a lot of conflict with each other had sometimes quite different ways of approaching conflict. And they looked at the strengths and limitations of each of their approaches. We ask each group to share their metaphors for conflict. So rather than trying to start out with some kind of a linear word-based approach, you said, draw a picture that represents your approach to conflict. And we weren't sure how's the word metaphor going to translate, because we wanted to get to those out of awareness aspects of culture that aren't always forward in our mind when we're using words, putting something in a narrative. But we wanted to go through art, we wanted to go through story. Immediately, the chief said, oh, we explained briefly what a metaphor was. He said, oh, in Bislama, which is our shared language, this is talk picture. It's a picture that talks and shares a story and shares a lot of meaning. So everyone got busy drawing their talk picture, again, which were quite different, one from the other. Then at the end of the session, we had the people from the different provinces put their metaphors up on the wall, walk around and look at each other's metaphors, to ask questions, to talk with each other. And it was a little bit like an exhibition at an art gallery. People were talking and murmuring and sharing. And you could just tell there was a lot of interest among each group for what other people's metaphors were. So there was a dialogue that followed the sharing of those metaphors. And this became a living museum of sort of conflict resources. Throughout the next 4 days, participants in the groups would go back again and again and again to their metaphors as an anchor point for explaining what was going on in conflict and explaining what might happen to transform conflict. So we also invited and explored the frameworks of conflict transformation that were coming out of these metaphors. So how could the conflict be understood more deeply? How could the current state of the conflict, which had historical roots, but how might it be assessed currently? How would more information be gathered in a culturally appropriate way? How might the conflict be transformed, again, in relationship to custom law and culturally appropriate? And then how would that agreement be either recorded or shared or indeed monitored in the community to make sure that it was a way, a program of approach that would actually be a benefit to the community. After all of this elicitive work, at the end of that first day, then we shared some Western frameworks and processes of dealing with conflict. And we were very as upfront as we could be about discussing their strengths and limitations, where they're appropriate, within Australian communities, where they're not, because there are many, many different peoples living in Australia. Next slide, please. So that's all the people from the different provinces working with each other in their different groups. Next slide. This is Chief Selwyn Garu on the right. He was the Secretary General of the Malva Tamari Council of Chiefs when we were working with them, and a member of the project team from the very beginning. And he had this metaphor that I found wonderful. He would explain to all of the other chiefs what this elicitive process means, because elicitive is a very academic term. And he would say, here's what it means to us. He'd say, we have bows and we have arrows, and we are all very skilled in using them, but we can always use a few more arrows. Likewise, we can always use a few new skills in transforming conflict, but we use them within our custom system. Next slide. An important part of cross-cultural worldview, negotiations and collaborations is the navigation of difference. Immediately within this first storyon, we encountered a worldview conflict. So we were there, our first one in 2007 in Port Vila in the capital. And this conflict arose out of a difference around ethics and epistemology. And it was influenced by the history of the ways in which Westerners have appropriated Ni Vanuatu knowledge, both in the colonial past and in the contemporary era. At the end of that first day of the storyon, the Ni Vanuatu facilitators, along with Chief Selwyn, reported that some of the high-ranking chiefs who were in the groups were very upset because they were concerned that the Australian facilitators, including me, under the direction of the Malva Tamari National Council of Chiefs, were stealing Ni Vanuatu knowledge. That we were going to take these metaphors and this knowledge and take it back to Australia, and no explanation of what we're going to do with it. And they threatened to take up a formal grievance against the Malva Tamari. They said they were going to leave the storyons. And we realized that we were in the middle of a worldview conflict around aspects of axiology, what was important to this group of chiefs, around ethics, what they considered to be moral behavior, and epistemology, what was considered to be true knowledge and how knowledge could be obtained in a good way. So we worked with the Ni Vanuatu facilitators, think, how can we address this? Those are genuine concerns. We don't want them to leave, and without an opportunity to explain what had been planned over the last year. And again, I said this is based on a history of appropriation of Ni Vanuatu knowledge. So we were thinking about the chief's position within the larger context of colonial relations of power, and we created some responses. First, the Ni Vanuatu facilitators went to the Ni Vanuatu chiefs and said, there's been a misunderstanding. We've been working on this for a year. This is not what we intend. Please come back, we will demonstrate to you that this is not what's going to happen. So the next morning, they all returned. We heaved a big sigh of relief and tried to be much clearer about this process of elicitive training. We're realizing and putting the own fault on our own lack of cultural fluency. So we again described in great detail elicitive training. It's centering Indigenous knowledge, but that Indigenous knowledge is not going to go out and be in a journal article somewhere or in a book or in a museum in Australia. All of your metaphors, your stories, your frameworks are going to stay here in Vanuatu for you to use within the Nakamals, for you to share across the provinces. Next slide. The conflict appeared to be de-escalating by the end of the second day. The Ni Vanuatu facilitators reported back to us that the concerned chiefs were very satisfied with how the storyons were progressing. Then on the final day of the storyons, there was at the end of the fifth day, we witnessed a formal resolution to this conflict. When we had assembled in the Nakamal for the closing ceremony, they would go, phew, okay, they came back, they're feeling it's good for their communities, it's okay. We're getting ready to start, and they yelled, stop. And I thought, oh no, we didn't transform this conflict. And they came forward and they said, we've been wrong. And we want to make right what we did wrong. We falsely accused Chief Selwyn Garu, and they asked him to come forward. And they had worked all week on creating these beautiful, huge hand-woven mats and baskets. They placed all of the mats and baskets on the floor. And then Chief Selwyn circled around these several times with his head bowed and his arms behind his back. And then the chiefs who had been upset and threatened to leave, they said, it's finished. we're reconciled. Now we can begin the closing ceremony of this story on in peace. We can now say with truth that we are peacemakers. So this was an example of where we thought we were starting out on the right foot. We almost got there, but not quite. But the strong relationships that we had built allowed us to recover that. There were other times when our collaboration, I would say, did not demonstrate integrity. It failed. And there's one of these that I want to share with you. So as you realize this, because you have a certain set of knowledge, doesn't mean that you can address all historical issues that arise. In Vanuatu, there's a difference between the spiritual orientation of custom mediation, what they call it custom mediation rather than conflict transformation, and the more secular orientation of Western professional and academic work with conflict. So several times during our collaboration, different members of the Mavatamari Council of Chiefs voiced their concern over the role that sorcery plays in conflicts that they're required to mediate. However, at the end of the first year, when we were meeting at UQ and members of AusAid were there, high-ranking members of the Peace Center were there, the Secretary General of the Mavatamari were there, and they said, we want your help with sorcery. And the people from Australia responded, not at all. There's just a silence, nothing. And then after about a minute, they changed the topic and moved on. So that UQ marked these spiritual issues as a non-discussable. Many of us who were, I was a very, very junior scholar at that time, we continued to work with the Mavatamari, but it was just, I think, an egregious error not to address the concerns of the Ni Vanuatu just because they didn't fit within Western academic worldview. These problems continued for many years in Vanuatu, and although the story-ons and the knowledge shared there has helped, that continues to be an issue of the ways in which Western academics and practitioners of conflict resolution tend to either marginalize or oppress or try to align all together the spiritual aspects of conflict transformation. In this, as imperfect as it might have been, although I will say that at the end of the 6-year project, when we did a review, just a long list from all the different provinces of the ways in which these story-ons have helped different chiefs to transform conflict. We see in this, as I said, imperfect but effective collaboration, we see an emphasis on process of honoring and recentering Indigenous worldviews while drawing on Western worldviews and ways that support them. We see an engagement with cyclical time of acknowledging the historical and contemporary harms of colonialism and Westernization, and indeed addressing them within the project in relation to how they can support conflict transformation. Next slide. Okay, I'm now going to switch to a different theme of conflict transformation and a different example of some of the work that I've had the honor to be involved in. The characteristic of conflict transformation that this story is to illuminate is a focus on relationships with previous opponents, or in the beginning, maybe with opponents, with ancestors, and with place. And to illuminate this theme, I'm going to share my experiences of attending and learning from the founders of the Myall Creek Massacre Memorial. And there's a warning for any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be in on this webinar. This section of the presentation includes images of community members who are now deceased. The Myall Creek Memorial takes place annually in June in Australia, on the site of one of the hundreds of massacres of First Nations Australians. I'm sharing with you my reflections on and my understandings of the 2006 memorial, and I invite you to travel there with me as I share this story. Next slide. It's 168 years since a brutal massacre of Aboriginal people occurred at Myall Creek in New South Wales, Australia. We've gathered at the nearby community hall in preparation for the 6th annual Myall Creek Memorial Ceremony. About 150 of us, settler-descended immigrants and Aboriginal Australians, including descendants of the victims and perpetrators, walked together in the rain along a country road in New South Wales, where the 38 Wiriailewe people, old men, women, and children, were bound in ropes and taken away to be massacred on the slopes below. We are now walking the route that they were forced along on that dreadful day. Next. This is Uncle Lyle Munro, one of the senior Aboriginal people who instigated the Myall Creek Memorial Ceremony. And he tells us it was also raining on June the 10th, 1838, when his people were murdered by colonial stockmen. That rain assisted in bringing the perpetrators to justice, as it created a path of muddy tracks that led William Hobbs, the property superintendent, to the massacre site. The rain today is a drought breaker, coming just in time to save crops and wildlife and the people who depend on them. Next slide. We arrive at the hilltop overlooking the massacre site and gather there, waiting for elders and senior people to arrive. We paint our foreheads with ochre and ashes, symbols of sorrow and grieving from both the Aboriginal and settler cultures. We pass through the smoke of eucalyptus leaves, an ancient and contemporary Aboriginal cleansing ceremony. We stop along the path where pairs of young people, both Aboriginal and those of settler descent, read the history of the massacre and the secret wars waged against Aborigines. This ritual marks each of the 7 memorial plaques along the path. Finally, we gather at a monolithic stone directly above the massacre site, greeted by the bay song of an Aboriginal bull roarer. And a bull roarer, if you haven't seen one, it's a oblong piece of wood on the end of a string. And when the Aboriginal young men turn it, it makes it sound like woo, 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 woo. And that's calling in the ancestors for this ceremony. Next slide. Sue Blacklock, the great-granddaughter of one of the survivors of the massacre, tells us that the bull roarer is informing the spirits of the Aboriginal dead that we have come to perform the ceremony, and calling everyone to be respectfully quiet. Then Rosemary Breen, a descendant of the settlers, leads us in prayers, explaining that we are surrounded now both by the spirits of those Aborigines killed on the slopes below and across the country, and by those settler people who have worked for justice, respect, and understanding between our peoples. Rosemary asks this ceremony give us courage for the work that lies ahead of us, and that it bring hope and healing to all of us. And we're reminded that this ceremony is the center of a network of living connections that reaches out to others and to other processes that sustain us and that sustain justice. Next slide. John Brown, the Uniting Church pastor who is instrumental in working with Aboriginal people to create the Myall Creek Massacre Memorial, recounts the history of the massacre and attempts to find justice and reconciliation. And he reads, "As we have walked along the path, we have recalled again the massacre that was perpetrated on the slopes below on the 10th of June, 1838. We have recalled also that several of the perpetrators were brought to justice for this crime." He then describes the current social justice processes that are connected to this day's ceremony. We're grateful for all the good work done over the past few years by Indigenous and non-Indigenous people working together to set the record straight about our history in this land, for the acts of personal reconciliation that have been achieved, for apologies offered and accepted, for forgiveness offered, for jobs created, and people included who were previously isolated. Next slide. This ceremony is not, as some critics claim, an event that encourages the losers of the frontier wars to become reconciled to current injustices and power imbalances. In contrast, in addition to mourning the colonial devastation of Indigenous peoples, this ceremony facilitates people expressing their commitment to actions that will address current violence and injustice toward Aboriginal peoples. In unison, those present, both Aboriginal and non-Indigenous descendants, intone, we acknowledge that we still have a long way to go in building a society where people have comparable opportunities to develop their innate potential. We're here today to commit ourselves again in the hard work of reconciliation between our peoples. We remember the past so that we may understand the present. We commit ourselves so that our children and our grandchildren may have a better tomorrow. So those of us who are there aren't left distant from this unthinkable horror. We're called to examine the role that we might play in similar circumstances, and to examine the role that we are playing in current situations of violence and injustice toward Aboriginal Australians. To this end, we all commit to the following, and we all recite this together. We know that oppression continues in the present, in the abolition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, and the failure to establish a new Indigenous representative body, and discrimination in schools, employment, shops, and the justice and healthcare systems, and the equity of access to and use of the land, and in a history still largely told from the perspective of non-Aboriginal people. Although the Myall Creek trial, which was held in the 1830s, was the first time in Australian history that white men were hanged for the murder of Aboriginal Australians, unfortunately, the verdict did not lead to full justice. Instead, the massacres of Aborigines continued for the next 90 years, and the secrecy around them deepened as many colonial people banded together to protect each other from prosecution. In this memorial ceremony at Myall Creek, we acknowledge that those of us alive today are the inheritors of the legacies of these massacres, and that they affect all of us living in this country. We're not here at this memorial to say fine words, shake hands, and walk away. We demonstrate our commitment to sustained relationships, and we envision these bonds stretching beyond this ceremony. Huddling together under umbrellas as the rain falls steadily, and looking out over the mist-shrouded site of the massacre, we all recite together. We will continue our journey, searching our own hearts and reflecting on our own attitudes, which alienate us from one another. Together, we will work for a future in which we are all able to contribute our gifts to this nation. We will work to end the injustices and prejudices which continue to sideline Indigenous people. We will learn and teach the paths of justice, respect, and reconciliation so that we may walk together down this road. We will work till a person's lot is no longer determined by their ancestry or skin color, and young people no longer bear a grudge against the society because it treats their history and culture unfairly. We will work till the history of 60,000 years is honored together with the history of the last 2 centuries, till the glorious parts are celebrated with pride and the dishonorable parts are acknowledged with shame. As the ceremony nears its close, once again, the bull roarer fills the clearing with song, and a settler-descended Australian gives a blessing for us all to walk together in connection with this land. Next slide. We all walk back together to the community hall at the foot of the hill, where we gather around a meal and hot cups of tea. We share stories, laughter, and tears. Many of us remain for the meeting of the Myall Creek Committee and participate in the discussions for the projects that are rising out of this day and the processes that have led to it. The Myall Creek Memorial was awarded the 2005 Australians for Native Title and Reconciliation Judith Prize for innovative reconciliation work. Now I'm going to take just a second because I see that my next section about the future of the Myall Creek is actually on another file. So give me 1 second here. That's not where Nancy and I said that Coyote might come to visit us. And I think Coyote did, because I need a second now just to chase my notes down. Those are the notes before I put in that part. So my apologies, and give me 1 second here. Oh, maybe I can change them. Okay. Well, on we go. We'll see how good my memory does with Coyote. Okay, so where are we on the slides? All right, next slide. Since the time of the 2006 memorial, the Friends of Myall Creek have created plans and are raising funds for a cultural center that will tell the stories of the massacre and of the Aboriginal and settler peoples who are working to effect justice. And these are what Friends of Mile Creek say. They say, imagine a strikingly beautiful, iconic Indigenous cultural and educational center as a visible demonstration of these atrocities and of the collaborations of integrity adjacent to the memorial site of the massacre. Imagine learning of the hundreds of massacres and the frontier wars across Australia. Imagine being inspired by those who courageously ensured that justice was done. Imagine being in a place of healing and so becoming a place of vibrant cultural expression that brings all Australians together. Stage 1 of their program, the memorial that I just shared the story about, already exists. Stage 2 will provide a culturally appropriate outdoor performance space for Aboriginal dance, drama, and storytelling, introducing many Australians to Aboriginal culture. Stage 2 will replant Indigenous bush gardens, preserving traditional foods and medicine, and informing the connection between culture, land, and farming. Stage 2 will commission public artworks, representative of the cultural explosion around Australia that's been generated. And stage 2 will include outdoor artwork to demonstrate how art can support conflict transformation. The annual performances at Myall Creek have supported the creation of sustained relationships between settlers, descendants of perpetrators, and Aboriginal peoples, with some of these deepening into kinship relationships. Next slide, please. So we see relationships that have been created between Aboriginal descendants of survivors and between non-Indigenous Australians. We see relationships have been renewed with ancestors and with place. And I will share some examples of these now. John Brown and Sue Blacklock, who you saw in there, Aboriginal elder and an Anglican pastor, are two of the people who came together and said, how can we mark this massacre site? How can we address this historical violence and link it to contemporary injustices? They formed a really strong relationship and collaboration that allowed the network to grow into what you see it as today. And I highly recommend, if you want to learn more about this, that you go to the Friends of Myall Creek website. The relationships also grew to include descendants of the perpetrators. I spent a couple of days with Beulah Adams, a woman whose great uncle was one of the perpetrators of the massacre. And she found out just by researching her genealogy, and she wanted to come forward and she wanted to support this process. She was very much afraid that they would reject her because of her background. In contrast, she says when she came forward and she said that her great uncle was a perpetrator, that the Aboriginal elders just opened their arms and embraced her. And these are her words. She said, Lyle Munro and Sue Blacklock and the Aboriginals actually said that I was to become their sister, a member of the Wirralurreg tribe. I've never had a sister. And Sue said, I would like you to be my sister. And that relationship continues on to this day. We also see restored relationships with place. And I want to share with you some of Mary Graham's knowledge about the Aboriginal concept of place. She is a senior Kombumerri woman of the Gold Coast in Australia, and she is a member of IEI's Advisory Council. Mary describes the centrality of the natural world within Aboriginal view, and these are her words. Land has a particular and privileged status in Aboriginal philosophy. This status is usually designated through the English language terms place and country. For Aboriginal people, these terms signal that land is not inert or inactive. Place is both a source and companion. It participates in reciprocal relationships with humans. It's a vehicle for the authentic explanation of how and why things come into the world. Meaning enters the world through place. The relationships established in this way provide a balance among spheres of social action, with place as the point of origin. And Mary goes on to say, balance and rebalance is achieved when place is used as an ontological compass, as a compass of our reality. Mary also explains how respect and reciprocity in relationships with the natural world provide a framework for conflict transformation within human relations. And again, these are her words. The land and how we treat it is what determines our humanness. Because land is sacred and must be looked after, the relationship between people and land becomes the template for society and social relations. Mary Graham. In the Mile Creek Memorial, these processes are described as reclaiming place, as John Brown explains. He says, I remember Aboriginal elder Lyle Munro saying as clear as anything, I've traveled down that road by the massacre sites hundreds of times, but never before today have I stopped there. This has been a bad place for Aboriginal people, but you've helped us to reclaim it. Then John Brown goes on. So the process was a reclaiming of this place, an honoring of the spirits of those who have died, and a washing of the place, as it were. Now, this is an okay place for us to be because the truth has been told and it's reclaimed it in a way. And John Brown goes on to share another example of how this land has been reclaimed. And he says, one of the odd things that happened quite independently of the memorial relates to that reclaiming. You know that there were skeletal remains of Aboriginal people that were taken to universities and museums in the United Kingdom. One was brought back, and it was a girl from the area. The Aboriginal Land Council was given responsibility for the burial, and they came to us and said, we would like to bury these remains at the Mile Creek Memorial. Would you allow us to? For them, the significance of that decision was, this land is now reclaimed, and it's safe for us to be here. So they came and they held the ceremonies and buried the remains there on that land, quite near the actual memorial rock. These things illustrate exactly that point, the reclamation of the land. John Brown. We also see in the Mile Creek Massacre memorials a focus on relationship with the ancestors. You saw how Auntie Sue Blacklock had the ancestors called in with a bull roar. There's also a video that I could recommend to you on the Friends of the Mile Creek website. And a part of that video, she's talking about the kind of transformation that's taken place through the memorials. And she talks about a shift in relationship with the ancestors of that place when they first came together to begin the memorial. And these are her exact words. And when we first started here to set up the memorial, there were scores of cockatoos. Those are big white birds in Australia with a yellow crest. There were scores of cockatoos, white ones. Next slide. Okay, the one where they were dancing there. It's the one I'm after, sorry. The one, yes, that one, thank you. And my family danced. Young teenage boys. Next. And grannies. As they danced, these cockatoos just rose up. They rose up, and they flew around and around and around. And they squawked, and then it rained. Next slide. I believe there were tears of joy, tears of relief that somebody recognized them and remembered them, and to get the truth out there. It rained every year after that, and now their souls are at rest. They are at peace. They're happy because we remember them. Auntie Sue Blacklock. So we see in the Mile Creek memorials an ongoing commitment to enhancing relationships among former opponents, relationships with place and with ancestors. Okay, next slide. This will be my third and final example. This is an example from conflict transformation about addressing the underlying issues of intractable conflict. You'll also see in here that focus on process and focus on relationship. I've just teased these out for examples. They're actually all woven together. So this conflict arises and is transformed through the Fort Vancouver Memorial. I had read about the Nez Perce memorials at Fort Vancouver, Washington, and I traveled there to attend the memorial and then to learn from both Native and non-Native people who were instrumental in facilitating the memorial and the justice initiatives arising out of the memorials. Next slide. So this memorial addresses many of the underlying issues that exacerbate colonialism, giving voice to silenced experiences of Native peoples, transforming the lack of knowledge about and respect for Native peoples on the part of non-Native people, recentering Native ways of knowing and being, acknowledging the harms of colonialism, and building relationships of respect and reciprocity, as well as engaging processes designed to address the violence and injustice of colonialism. Next slide. The Fort Vancouver Memorial is held annually in Vancouver, Washington, where members of the Nez Perce Nation and other Native nations join together with non-Native descendants, immigrants, local government officials, and members of the United States Army stationed at Fort Vancouver. They're all there to honor the Nez Perce. The discussion and relationship building that led up to the memorial began in the late 1990s. It involved truth-telling of the incarceration of Red Heart's band during the War of 1877. Royce Pollard, formerly the Army commander of Fort Vancouver and then the mayor of Vancouver, explained that Chief Red Heart's band of old men and women and children were trying to make their way back to the reservation when they were captured by the United States Army without cause, largely out of frustration that the Army could not catch Chief Joseph's band. So the Army brought these 29 members of Red Heart's band to Fort Vancouver. They incarcerated them for 8 months, where they were badly mistreated, inadequately housed, and put on public display. They were never tried or judged as guilty of any crimes of war. And a small Nez Perce boy died while Red Heart's band was incarcerated at the fort and was buried in an unmarked grave. These unaddressed injustices were a source of deep division between the Nez Perce and the non-Indigenous peoples living there. Honoring this young boy who passed is one of the rituals in the memorial each year. Wilfred Scott, then chairman of the Nez Perce Tribal Council, shared a story regarding this child. And he says, but when we went over there to the first memorial, the Nez Perce people, when we do these memorials, we have giveaways in honor of that young boy that was buried there at Fort Vancouver, a 2-year-old. We took a blanket, and you've seen that blanket. She still had that blanket, a little Pendleton blanket. We put it on a chair and put it out there on the Buffalo Road. So when we had done our horses and the people had done their sharing of gifts, I asked for somebody with a 2-year-old or a baby to come forward. When she got up, she was sitting on the far side of the circle, and she came across. She had that little baby boy with a blanket wrapped around him. She was packing him. And when she came across, I asked her for her name. So she told me what her name was. And as soon as she said Mary Wood, then I knew the story. So I had to tell the story behind that because there's a long connection between the Wood family and the Nez Perce. She had been a supporter of the memorial every year since it started. She hosts a dinner the night before. So Friday night, everybody is invited out to their place. They have their own house that they call Wood's Landing. That's right near a creek there. They call it Chief Joseph's Creek, and that's their place. That was Erskine Wood's home site. They kept it going. So that's how our relationship came about. And it's been a good relationship, a good experience. Next slide. On the left here, you will see Horace Axtell, elder, veteran, and knowledge holder of the Nez Perce. And on the right, Wilfred Scott, who then was the chairperson of the tribal council. So that meetings between them and the mayor of Fort Vancouver, Royce Pollard. So Wilfred Scott sent a letter to the mayor, and he said the Nez Perce would be glad to come to Vancouver, but he said the only reason we're coming there is to honor our people. And he explained that through the years, because of this Fort Vancouver Memorial, we received all kinds of positive letters, articles from people around the world and around the country who have attended with their expression of what they've learned, how people can come together and learn from the past, the injustices of it. Horace Axtell described the injustice of colonial suppression of Native spirituality and the ways that the memorial disrupts that suppression. And these are his words. One thing I want to mention also, my nephew, who's referring to Scotty, was talking about it. Most of these people that participate really strongly in what we do are descendants of warriors and the people that were in the 1877 war. There's a lot of us that are descendants of some of the participants that had to be a part of that. All of these were mostly non-Christian people. All the old spirituality that they were involved in wasn't very welcomed when they first come here. They got run out of Joseph, Oregon in that place. A lot of their old spirituality was not welcome. So they wanted to go where they could have freedom. That's why they were being chased also by the generals in the army to bring them back and make them stay on the reservation. But they were going out for freedom. That's one of the things I always mention, the freedom that we're after. Still, we're after freedom right now. So there's still a long ways to go yet. But these things that we do in these ceremonies honor our past. People that were having this problem with the United States Army. It has to be proven to the rest of the people that we were not fighting, we were being chased, but we had to defend ourselves when they started killing our people. We had to. It became like a war then. So I had some people in that also. My great-grandfather died over there in Bear Paw in the last battle. Another important part is that we bring our horses to these ceremonies. You've probably seen that. Next slide. And then Horace Axtell goes on to explain, for the last couple of years or so, we kind of missed our horses, but now they're back. And I'm glad of that because that was the way. They were traveling with horses. And then when they came to the end of this conflict, well, the army and whoever worked with them killed all of our horses. So that was another big hurt. So now we finally got some horses back. It's always been a good feeling to see them dressed up the proper way and being ridden by men with war bonnets on. That's an important part to me. That honoring of the old warriors, bringing out the old regalia, the feathers and all of that. It's a way of life. It's all very important. We have a lot of our young people getting involved now. Some of my grandchildren and Scotty's grandchildren, they're all doing really good. Makes me proud to see them there. We try to get people involved. Like I always ask the younger boys to come up in the ceremony. I honor them with a feather of some kind. We're holding up our end, I think. It's always good to be there. And when you get finished with that, you feel so good afterwards. Next slide. Horace Axtell shares further about the restoration of the way of the horse. And again, in his words, I think I was telling you about Hinmatuyu Yalatvat, Chief Joseph, who was exiled up to the Colville Reservation. They're all different kinds of bands of people. They're a confederated tribe. So when they got sent there, they became part of the confederated tribes. With Chief Joseph, they gave him an area where to stay, and he was camped along the river. He lived there for I don't know how many years until he died in 1906 or something like that. He had this place there in Erskine Wood. So we're back now to the grandfather of that woman who came across the ceremonial grounds with her baby. That's her grandfather. Erskine Wood had been a participant in the war with their ancestors. Anyway, one of the boys was sent, like a friendly experience, I guess you would say. They wanted to learn some of the things that Chief Joseph stood for. So the young Wood boy stayed there. He did a lot of things with Chief Joseph. So when they asked him to come back home, this young boy asked Chief Joseph before he left, I've been here quite a while, and I would like to know anything you'd like to have from my people as a gift. So all Chief Joseph said was, he kind of smiled and said, I'd like to have a black horse. And so many years went by until one of these younger ladies, her name was Mary Wood, the granddaughter of Erskine Wood, she decided that her request should be fulfilled because it never had. Nothing ever happened. I don't know, it just kind of wore off. So she got together with her family and said that she thought they should fulfill that request to get that horse. So they decided they would get together and they purchased a stallion. Next slide. They got an Appaloosa stallion, a beautiful thing. And so I was sitting at home one day and I heard a car drive up and this lady got out and it was Mary Wood. She came to ask me, she said, I have a question. You probably know more people than I do on the Colville tribe where the Nez Perce are. And she said, is there a descendant up there from Chief Joseph that we could give this horse to? And I said, yes, one of the men that I know would be an excellent person to give that to. Who had just passed away not too long ago. And that was Joe Red Thunder. He was a grandnephew of Chief Joseph. So I said, we've got one of the boys who's a participant in the Longhouse, and he lives the traditions, and he's also a Vietnam veteran. I think it would be nice if you gave it to him. And she said what was his name, and I told her his name was Soy Red Thunder. I gave her his address and phone number, and that following year we went to Chief Joseph Days in Oregon, and that's where it happened. Sunday after everything, and the celebrations were over, and we were having our worship out there at the place. We go, and Sunday morning before we leave, we have our 7 drum service out in the pasture. The landowner told us we could use that place. One of the friends of Joe Red Thunder. We go back there every year. Since that time, for right in that area is where we had the giveaway, giving up the horse to Soy Red Thunder. What a beautiful animal. Registered Appaloosa stallion breed. It wasn't really broke. And he laughed. He said, but we managed to get him through. He didn't want to stand. Nice spirited horse. That's the kind of horse I like. And from Uncle Horace Axtell. The memorial is made of many ceremonies that honor the Nez Perce. Respectful engagement with Native ways of knowing and being is evidenced through the centering and the celebration of their ceremonies, which were banned and illegal in the United States until 1978, when the law was changed. This suppression of many cultural rituals that were meaningful to Native peoples meant the ceremonies were disrupted or driven underground in some instances, not spoken about publicly. The memorial includes many Native rituals: the pipe ceremony, signifying peaceful relations, the gift giving, to honor both those living and those who have passed on, signifying interdependence and generosity of spirit. And next slide. The empty saddle ceremony, paying respect to those who have died. The empty saddle ceremony involves a number of Nez Perce in full regalia who honor the dead of all of those present at the ceremony, bringing into symbolic relationship both the descendants of Native and non-Native peoples. Royce Pollard, who then was the mayor of Vancouver, also describes his perspective of the role of Native spirituality and addressing the underlying issues that take place at this memorial and that caused the original conflicts. And these are his words. The Nez Perce said they would like to come to Vancouver to send a delegation to look at the grounds and see if they could feel some connection to their people. So myself and Bob Knight, the commander of the Army barracks, and a couple of other people from the National Park Service, and Wilfred Scott and Horace Axtell walked the ground. The place was over there, away from Officers Row, in kind of a hollow. It may have been in this area, and it certainly wouldn't have been anyplace else. And we're standing down there in the meadow, and Uncle Horace is standing there, and he said, you know, I think this is the area. He was looking up, and he said, I think this is the area. And we looked up, and there were 2 eagles circling overhead. And Uncle Horace said, yes, we could have a ceremony here. And this is now the site of the annual Fort Vancouver Memorial. And wrapping this up, I want to share with you also what Horace Axtell said about relationships. We've been talking about addressing these underlying issues, you know, the violence and the injustice and the disrespect. But he also talks about how relationship that took place. And he says, the relationship goes back a long way, that part altogether. The people at Fort Vancouver are just like a family to us now, and they feel that way with us too. So it all comes together when the right things take place. Next slide. And one more. So the Fort Vancouver Memorial addresses many of the underlying issues that continue to exacerbate the divisions between the Nez Perce and non-Native peoples. As Horace Axtell says, there's still a lot of work to be done, but we do see many of the strong characteristics of conflict transformation, a focus on the process of honoring and ethically engaging Indigenous worldview, an emphasis on relationship with humans, previous opponents, the natural world, and with place. We see a very strong emphasis on addressing the underlying issues of colonialism that are exacerbating conflicts. And we see an emphasis on an action for envisioning and supporting a future that's moving toward balance and harmony. Wado, thank you. Galielega, I'm grateful for this time to share what I have learned about transforming conflict involving Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples through these courageous and creative people working in collaboration with integrity.
Thank you so much, Polly. Wado, ahihe, and thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I've learned so much, and I love the way you have the stories illustrating the points that you're making, and I think we'll all remember these stories for a very long time. It's beautiful to see that something positive can come out of something so horrific in the past, and I know that these incidents have not left the minds and spirits of the Indigenous peoples, and so addressing them and with a good intention and truly trying to reconcile and transform is so important. Really loved your words from the Australian Aborigines. Mary Graham's words are going to stay with me for a long time. So many, many thanks for this presentation. I think it was very important for so many of us to hear and put some of these things into practice. At this point, we do have some questions for our speaker, and I would like to turn over the mic to the Indigenous Education Institute Vice President and Associate Professor at the University of New Mexico in the Department of Pharmacy, Dr. David Begay, and he will field the questions and answers for Polly. If you have a question, you can put it in the chats, and I haven't seen as many chats in this presentation as I have in some others, so it may be you haven't seen the chat screen, but you're welcome to go in now and add your chats or your questions. And in the meantime, we've had some that have come in during the registration. So I'm going to turn this over to David Begay at this point. David?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. A couple of questions came together, and I will ask the questions now. The first question is a two-part question. What are some of the on how to engage in Indigenous transformation? The second question today, that's the first question. I think the second question is also somewhat related, although distinct, to collaboration and dialogues with Indigenous and non-Indigenous.
Cody.
David, we lost you there for a second, and when you've come back, you're muted. I think we missed most of the first question there. If you could try again, please.
Okay. Okay. What are some of your recommendations on how to engage and build relationship with Indigenous people on conflict resolution or conflict transformation? Is there a common thread people should be aware of? Did you get that?
I think so. Did you feel that's clear, Nancy?
Yeah, that second question is clear. Why don't you start with that, and then we can go back to the first one.
So I say from my experience of working with Cherokee elders and knowledge holders and living in Australia and working in Vanuatu and Fiji and then back again here in Turtle Island, that I think the recommendations and common threads are very similar. And I would say to be aware of what respect means, what a respectful reaching out to build relationships might look like. And the way you begin to learn that one is educate yourself about the history of the particular area and the nations, indigenous nations that you would like to build relationships with people within. And I would say in that education, it's really important to, watch documentaries, read books, read articles that are written by Native people themselves, not by someone else speaking or talking for Native peoples. I think it's really, really important to listen deeply to story. You might think you would, think, oh, I'd learn a lot, and you would probably learn a lot reading a conflict transformation professional journal article written by a Native person. You'll also learn a lot listening to traditional Indigenous stories. Can give you an example. I was talking with my colleague David Begay, and he was sharing how powerful Navajo stories are in transforming conflict, because those stories can sort of point the spotlight away from the person who's involved in the conflict, and they can listen to the story to learn how it affects other people and to think about ways of transforming that conflict. I know we have a very central, you might call it a Cherokee creation story about the coming of Akni, the strawberry, and what that tells us about both how to prevent conflict, but how to transform conflict once it occurs. So listen to those stories. They're not just children's stories. They're not myths or fables. They're stories for us to learn, how to be human together on this beautiful earth, and how to move towards that dynamic balance and harmony. I would say also then, go to as many public ceremonies. A lot of ceremonies are open to the public, the ones that I've talked about. So you get to know people, meet people, go to any public presentations. And then I think when you approach someone and you've learned a bit about the respectful way to approach them in their particular culture, because they're going to vary. Not all Native peoples will be exactly the same. And that would be to speak from your heart, to not come in as, with an academic or professional hat on. You must certainly carry that expertise with you. But to speak person to person, to make it clear what kind of a commitment you're willing to make, to build those relationships or to share your expertise. It takes a lot of work. I mean, think about the painful history, multiply that by thousands of times of what we've talked about today. So I wouldn't shy away from it because it's hard, it needs to be done. But there are a lot of things you can do to prepare before, rather than just walking in cold. And then I would say that is there a common thread to, once you've made the approach, that some people are going to say no for very good reason. They're not going to work with you. And then, you would approach someone else who might have the time, or who might have a common shared interest, or might have some kind of connection with you. And you start to build those relationships. To remember that although all the different Native approaches to peace or Native approaches to conflict transformation vary, there are going to be a lot of shared threads among them that aren't so common among the Western world seeking to transform conflict. And one of those is an emphasis on cyclical time, that the past, present, and the future all coexist. So those harms of the past, we might be talking, as conflict about a telescope that is built or is going to be built, but those historical harms are going to resonate just as loudly, or maybe even more importantly, in this conflict. So think about cyclical time, about the influence of the past, present, and future as they shape each other, as they are together. In Australia, it's called the every win. I also think about the importance of spirituality. Spirituality is an integral part of Native worldviews and Native processes of conflict transformation. And to honor and respect that vast network of relationships. The Cherokee relationship with Ani, the strawberry, is just as important as a Cherokee relationship with humans that might be in conflict with them, with place, with ancestors, with all of our more than human relations. And to learn more and to be respectful of how Indigenous peoples and Indigenous ways of knowing and being are place-based. They are in place in relationship with a particular place, through respect and reciprocity, and to be aware of that and to honor that. Kind of a long answer to your question, David. I would like to say, though, I'd also be happy if there's something that Nancy and David has much more experience than I do in working here in Turtle Island. If there's something you want to add to that response, I would be very open to that.
Well, I would like to just expand the question a little bit and ask you, just for our audience's benefit, if you could talk about the difference between conflict resolution and conflict transformation.
So conflict resolution can be very helpful if a conflict is shorter term, doesn't have a lot of historical roots, if it doesn't rely on ongoing strong relationships taking place after that, and if it's a little bit more linear cause and effect. And in that case, mediation, negotiation, problem solving can be very effective. But a lot of the conflicts that we look at, that we experience in Native country, are what we call intractable conflicts. Okay? They have long historical roots and they operate like a system. So rather than just being there's one thing or one or two main things that are affecting this conflict, and if we address them, then we can resolve it. You know, there may be 70, there may be 100 feedback loops that are keeping this conflict stuck into place. So it's taking that long-term relationship building, realizing that, you know, if these conflicts have historical roots that are hundreds of years old, we need to build sustainable relationships that will last in our lifetime, with a vision of them, you know, these relationships lasting through our children's and grandchildren's lifetimes, because it's going to take a long time to transform these systems. So colonialism is a system. It's not going to go away because of, you know, one particular effective set of ceremonies. So it's understanding how all of these things are connected and how we work to disrupt as many of those as possible while building feedback loops of balance and harmony that lead to balance and harmony, or feedback loops that lead to justice. So for me, conflict transformation, that's that focus on process. You know, it's not just a simple, if we fix this, then everything will be okay. And why there's that focus on relationships, because those relationships need to be long-term and take us through the long term. We need to think about how we extend those. And I think it's more about, it's being aware of those wider networks and of that flux. And thinking conflict resolution might be, well, we need to put this telescope up, or we need to put this wall up. How can we get that done? Or how can we get that done in a way that's agreeable to everyone? Versus how do we address the harms of the past? I remember, you know, at a gathering that we had recently, we was talking about a telescope, a conflict around a telescope, but what kept coming up were the harms of boarding schools, the harms of the loss of language. That's where conflict transformation comes in, because it understands and allows us to bring together how those are all shaping each other and how we can design the best ways to address them. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. I'll turn it back to David.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. There's one other question. The concept of conflict resolution, conflict transformation. Has the concept been applied, one that you know of? And if not, do you have any recommendation on bringing this work to the younger people?
Did I understand you correctly, David, is it once again about the difference between conflict resolution and conflict transformation, as well as how to bring it to young people?
Yeah, and K through 12 students.
Yet I have taught primarily college students, but I would say with high school students, the really good way to do that is with sharing a story, a practice story, where people are already working together, where non-Indigenous, non-Native and Native peoples are working together. If it could be close to your area where you could actually take them, if you live, somewhere in Washington, you could take them to the Fort Vancouver memorials. I think having them involved in something, seeing, learning more about the history of their area, and then thinking too, because thinking of the past, present, and future, what can we do that makes a difference? So as an example, the young people at the Mile Creek Memorial are central to the ceremonies there. And once we get to the top of that massacre site, and everyone goes through the smoke of the gun leaves, then there are history markers all along the trail. And a young Aboriginal person stands next to a non-Indigenous Australian, and they read aloud that history. So they learn that history, but they're also taking a role in the agency of showing their commitment to contemporary justice and sharing this history with a wider Australian populace who might not know it at all. So I would say, think about ways, again, relationship with place to bring those stories as close to home as you can, and to get the students involved so they can experience that. That would be my recommendation. And there are many endeavors out there.
I see a couple of other questions on this chat. Do you want to read them, David, or do you want me to?
Yeah, yeah, I keep going in and out. My reception is very poor at this time. Can you go over them?
Sure. And I just want to mention David's on the Navajo reservation right now, and this is a good example of social inequity. He has one of the worst Wi-Fi that you could ever have, and it goes in and out and in and out all the time. But he's so integral to what we do that we just go with the flow with him. So thank you, David. I see two that have come in on the chat. I think the one that was from, oh my gosh, there's more than I thought. The one that came from Betty, I think you answered that one. And then I think there's one person is asking if you know of any applications of these well, I think you answered that one about the K through 12 schools. How do you estimate an adequate time for these meetings and processes to play out? And then there's another question after that. And then I think at that point, we will close the session.
Well, the answer to that first question about time is not a very popular answer to the question, because in conflict transformation, it can take as long to transform it as it did to create it. So if we're looking at generations or centuries of injustice and power imbalance and relationships of colonial subjugation, it may take hundreds of years to address it. But rather than giving up and saying, oh, we can't do that, looking at it through a systems-based approach, you look at what can we do now that's going to make a significant difference and that's going to transfer to this generation, to the next generation, so we keep on changing that. I know John Paul Lederach, who is the Western conflict transformation scholar that I regard most highly, as a colleague and friend, he said he nearly got run out of a conference when he said that it could take hundreds of years to address some of these kinds of injustice that it fixed now. But that's, it can take a long time, and that's why it's so important to build those ongoing relationships.
Thank you for your wise words. And this is one that we would probably close with, but by the way, the people that asked the questions are thanking you for your answers. Have you accidentally caused a conflict? Have you accidentally caused a conflict? For example, the individual asking you who to give the horse to.
Me personally, I shared that one very embarrassing conflict that we did in Vanuatu.
Yeah.
It was a collaborative conflict. I'm trying to think of personally. I mean, I cause conflicts all the time, personally. I think that's a part of the human condition, but I'm trying to think this is not a huge conflict, but nevertheless, a place where I think it's a very common example. So I'll give it. When I I went up for citizenship in Australia. I hold dual citizenship because I thought I'd get kicked out of the country for protesting with Aboriginal peoples. I thought, well, I better get my citizenship so I won't get kicked out of the country. And before I went to the official government offices, I went to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait elders and within Brisbane, and I asked their permission to apply for citizenship in Australia. But didn't really cause a conflict with someone, but it was a very inadequate response because there are two different groups of Aboriginal people, the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, who are the traditional owners. I just went to the one sort of city recognized group of the elders. It would have been much more appropriate. It showed my lack of knowledge about how complex the conflict was. It marked me as, you know, very, very beginner. It had been much more appropriate if I had talked to lots of different groups of elders rather than just one group of elder.
Thank you, Polly. And this is just a beautiful comment that somebody just put in, so we can end on something very positive. Luna says, I actually thought it would take longer. It takes but a second to wound someone, and healing takes much longer. So, Polly, I wanted to ask you if you could put your contact information in the chat in case anybody would like to get in touch with you individually.
I am doing that right now.
Good. Okay, so you all know how to reach Polly now. Thank you all. Thank you, David, for fielding questions. Thank you, Polly, for your wonderful talk. Thank you as an audience for being so engaged and responsive. And it was interesting to watch with the participants that as the talk went on, the amount of participants kept growing. Usually they drop off more. So this was something I was looking at and thinking, that's fascinating. Let's see, we have been recording most of the speakers' presentations, all but one actually, who was not able to be recorded because he had an agent. All of these presentations that have been recorded are on the IEI website, which Chris has already put in the chat box, but it's Indigenous, www.indigenouseducation.org. You'll go to the multimedia link and you will be able to download any of the talks. It's free and you can use them however you wish. For example, Robin Kimmerer, who was a very popular speaker we had on, actually uses a lot of these talks in her own classrooms. So you're able to do that. So it's very available. In closing, I want to extend a very special thank you to our technical support, Christopher Tarrant of Tarrant Solutions in Friday Harbor, Washington. Every time we host one of these speakers, there is so much work that goes on behind the scenes. The coyote factor, it's real. It's a Navajo disruptor and bringer in chaos, is always lurking somewhere. And Chris is the one who always comes up with a plan B or C to counter the possible chaos. We will be sending out an email to you just after this presentation with a very short survey asking your reaction to what you've heard today. Please take the time to answer the questions because your responses are really helpful to us to inform our future program design. If there's somebody you think would be spectacular, like our other speakers, for us to host, let us know that too. And subjects that you might be interested in us exploring further. Our next speaker is scheduled for September 28th, I believe, and it's Elizabeth Azus. She is a member of the Yurok Nation in Northern California, and she's an acknowledged expert on Indigenous perceptions of wildfires and how to mitigate the dangers of them, and how Indigenous people for thousands of years have cultivated their lands to mitigate the harm caused by the fires. And so I think it's very topical conversation, and because of all the wildfires we're having. And I hope you'll tune in and join us in September. So from all of us to all of you, thank you. Wado in Cherokee and Nahihe in Navajo. Hope you have a beautiful day and weekend, and thank you for being with us. Goodbye.